in such very good time, and I know the traffic has been absolutely appalling because everybody that I work with has been texting me all morning going, honestly, I'm coming. So my name is Sheila Gilheeney. I'm CEO of Alcohol Action Ireland, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here today to this, our second event of our what we call End the Silence Week. So End the Silence for us actually started 2 years ago, but it actually has its origin going back to 2019. And Alcohol Action Ireland at that stage, we were in contact with a number of people who had this lived experience of having grown up with a problem with alcohol in the home. They had grown up with what we are now terming parental problem alcohol use. And a group of 3 women started an initiative with Alcohol Action Ireland called Silent Voices. And I have to tell you, that name, Silent Voices, has been quite prophetic, because we have found this actually quite a difficult topic to raise in public or for people to be able to speak about it. And yet we know it to be something that's absolutely endemic right across our country. Just to give you, some figures, up until this, we would have used a figure of 200,000 children currently living in a situation, 1 in 6 children, experiencing that at the moment. And we did an extrapolation ourselves just on kind of census data, said, well, how many adults is that? And we got a figure of about 600,000, which is a lot. But we actually had research being presented yesterday by colleagues in Maynooth University who did a survey and just simply asked people, what have you experienced, and looking at other adverse childhood experiences. And they found that 25% of adults in Ireland have grown up in this particular situation. And the thing about it is, so often this is a problem. It has all sorts of impacts. It has impacts on the daily lives of people, of children in particular. There's the uncertainty, the not quite sure the ground that you're on. You have the complex thing of all the love in the world between a parent, but where is the parent maybe sometimes when needed. But on top of all of that, we know that this is a gateway ACE to other problems. And today the focus of our event is to try and look at that intersectionality between a number of other things. And in particular, we want to look at where it crosses over with a mental health problem in the home, and that's just huge, just really is. And then also with domestic violence, again. And we have all these intersections, and within those intersections, you have children who very often, their voices are not necessarily heard. But we know that there are, at the same time, very good examples of practice here in Ireland where those voices are being listened to and where practices are being adapted, and trying to really, I suppose, focus on, well, what has happened to you and what can we do about that, as opposed to saying there's something wrong with you, when very often the reactions that people are having, they're just what you would do. I mean, they're just completely normal. Absolutely explanatory. This is why somebody is behaving or has a particular approach to life because of, what they have actually experienced. So this morning we're going to explore those areas. We have a great panel of speakers. I have circulated the agenda there. Hopefully you'll see it. But I'm very pleased actually to welcome, first of all, our chair for this morning, Ailbhe Smyth. Ailbhe is the patron of our initiative, Silent Voices, and Ailbhe, you're well able to talk for yourself, so you'll be able to introduce where you want to be. But she is somebody who's grown up in this sphere, and we are absolutely honoured to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here for this, as Sheila said, the second event in a trio of events which is focusing on this very difficult and really in many ways very painful issue for, I think, so many of us here in this country. I mean, let me say straight away that I was I felt very honoured but also very touched when Sheila asked me if I would become a patron of Silent Voices, because I had happened to mention in a very quiet kind of way at a conference on trauma that I myself grew up in a family where there was parental alcohol misuse, where my father drank, and it had taken me 50, nearly 60 years to actually publicly acknowledge that and to even begin to look at the impact that that had on my own life, never mind the life of my siblings. And I can tell you that I didn't name it as that for 40, 50 years, 60 years, but I can see now the traces that it left, and that experience, of my experience, was not a dramatic one. It was not one which involved physical violence of any kind, but it was nonetheless marking. It left its traces, it has left its scars, and I felt that I could think of nothing better than to try in some way to support such a wonderful project and endeavour as this, because we know that there are something like 250,000 children who are living in that situation themselves today. And how many, 500,000 adults, I don't know, I'm never very good at the...
Amazingly, a million.
A million.
Was the figure that was actually put out
Adults.
yesterday. A million.
That should be no surprise to us in this country. But of course, the great surprise in some ways is that it is still such a taboo topic. And I have myself encountered what I can only call a kind of omerta around this experience, that people, I have some experience of talking about things that people don't talk about in this country. And I can tell you that this is very profound. And you can see people actually physically moving away when you say, oh, well, my father was an alcoholic. And yet people will come up to you later and say, I had that experience too. So it's about time that we really break this silence for all kinds of reasons, but first and foremost, so as to be able to provide supports and protections for families, and particularly for the children within those families, and that we begin to acknowledge the difficulties of adult children. So we're absolutely honoured today to have four really wonderful speakers who I'll be introducing now, and we'll follow that up at the end of their presentations with a panel discussion, but which is also very much an opportunity for you to make your own comments and to ask questions. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce as our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Morton from UCD, who is going to talk about the intersectionality of substance abuse, of women's substance abuse in Ireland. And I have to say myself, I don't think it's accidental that I have come to be associated with issues which are at this intersectionality. I work with Ballyfermot Star Addiction Services and have done for very many years. I'm chair there, and I also have the honour of being chair of Women's Aid. And I didn't actually name this as something which was part of my own background, but actually it really is. So Sarah is the director of the Community Drugs Programme in the School of Social Policy and Social Work at UCD. She is a very experienced researcher and has worked in the field of policy practice and outcome evaluation when it comes to looking at very complex issues, including domestic violence and drug and alcohol abuse. Sarah, you are very welcome here this morning. We look forward very much to your talk. Thank you for being with us.
I know I have to work buttons. Okay, super. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation, Ailbhe. So I have 20 minutes to basically highlight to you some really important things out of what is probably certainly one of the most important studies that I've done in my career. And this study has looked at the intersectionality of women's substance use within the Irish context, and there are so many elements of it that are important when we start to think about alcohol, and some of those I'll just highlight at the end. I'm going to give you a little tiny bit of background. This study emerged from these two previous pieces of work. The study was funded by the IRC and done in partnership with Merchants Quay, and we had a range of other agencies that were then a part of the advisory group for this study. But in this initial study that we'd done with Merchants Quay with practitioners, it was an action learning study, and one of the practitioners, he said this really important thing, and it sat with me for about 2 years before we were able to enact this current study. He said, why are we not seeing women before they get to these levels of trauma and trouble? Women are hugely underrepresented at the start of their difficulties. They present when something drastic has happened, a hospitalisation, an overdose, the loss of children. Why are they not asking for help before that? What we knew from the European work on the gender policy across Europe is that I was really surprised, because the two things that were left with me after that project is that we were actually contributing some of the examples of best practice, including the SAIL project, of which we have representatives today, and that there was no evidence or narratives from women in any research setting across Europe that we could find as part of this project where women talked about all of the complexities of their experience. So this has led to us making the decision to do this study. I'm not going to go through the literature in any great detail because we're limited on our time, but just to highlight a few little things is that we do have great innovation around this in Ireland, and I think you've already flagged that, Sheila, in terms of there's some real pockets of thinking about how we can engage with the complexity of women and children's substance use and start to engage with those intergenerational patterns. But we have not had that opportunity to really hear what women's experiences are. We also know that motherhood is quite a factor around how we think about women's substance use. It can be a point of intervention, but it can also be a process where she feels further stigmatized, and it may block her from seeking help. And it is also important to note that our previous study, practitioners had talked about how women actually felt isolated if they weren't mothers, so that they hadn't fulfilled those identities. The study aimed to explore the experiences and needs of women who were dealing with multiple issues, including problematic substance use, with a view to gaining this really in-depth understanding of their life experiences, their substance use trajectories, and how those related to factors such as motherhood, poverty, social exclusion, residency status, trauma, domestic violence, transactional sex, homelessness, and incarceration. Just a really important kind of points to add is methodologically, we did this through in-depth interviews, and women needed to have engaged with to some degree with services so that they did have a support network, but also we did interview women that were at various stages of their journey. So some women may have been abstinent, some may have been in treatment services, some may have been in stabilisation, detox, or engaging in harm reduction services. And we did in-depth interviews. One of the most important things for me was around this idea of informed consent. So I spent a long time discussing with each woman that participated in the research how her data would be handled, how it would be transcribed, de-identified and anonymised. And that was agreed with every woman who participated in the study. And then for the women that wanted this, we went back to them and talked to them about the quotes that we would like to use in settings like this and in the report, and also the context of those quotes. So we really tried to push that idea of informed consent far beyond in the moment. It was really important to me as a researcher that she could look back at this in a year or 2 years or 3 years and never have any sense of discomfort around her participation in this study. We interviewed 14 women. Saturation in terms of data and themes was really emerging around 6 or 7 women. If we had had more time, it would have been lovely to extend the sample, but we were very restricted around the funding. The women's age range was from 25 to 60, and all were white Irish women. 4 of the women were currently using substances, and the remaining defining themselves as abstinent. This is where it starts to get interesting. So the substances used by women were alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, and medication misuse. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this kind of substance use patterns later in the findings. Not surprisingly, the majority of the women were mothers. So again, we're linking back into this intergenerational patterns. And I'm also going to talk in one of the findings around their families of origin. The themes, so we ended up with this incredibly complex data set, so rich, so in-depth, and women that participated in this study were phenomenal in how they engaged and discussed their life experiences, but also talked to us about how they had engaged with services, what had worked for them, and what had been challenging. We ended up with 5 themes: the substance use patterns and prevalence, their relationships and family, stigma and shame, and then this really complex set of intersectionalities, particularly around mothering, homelessness, transactional sex and prostitution, criminal justice, and mental health and trauma. And then finally, we had this major theme around how they engage with support and interventions, and some sub-themes around this. There's an incredibly large number of slides outlining all these findings, which what I'm going to do is actually flick to the theme and with some of the sub-theme information, but I'm really more going to focus on the quotes from the women and try and pull out some key messages for you. I am going to dwell a little bit on this one because I think it's important in terms of the theme of your conference today. Initiation of use that occurred in teenage years was often women described due to either family use or availability within the wider community setting. So women talked a lot. It was very common that they talked about the Sheila, how could you not have turned your phone off? I'm just having a moment where I was like, is mine off? Is it me? But they often talked about family use. So this was very common in their experiences, and that often contributed to their availability. For me, as someone who's focused a lot on substance use over the last 10 to 15 years, and substance use prevalence and trajectories and substances of choice, women used whatever was available. So they didn't seek particular substances. It depended on what was in their family, what was in their community setting, and often there was a partner or a person in the immediate context who was the supplier or assisted with supply. Alcohol was absolutely throughout all of the women's experiences. So it was either alcohol only, alcohol and medication, or alcohol and poly use. Not one woman in the study said, oh, I never used alcohol. So it formed the basis of their, I suppose, substance use trajectories. And we'll see from a quote later on just about how women understood the role of alcohol. And I'm just going to pull a little bit out from this quote. This particular woman said, if I had 3 or 4 cans left, Jesus, it was literally a hug, a comfort. You're okay, you're all right. Regardless to being drunk, obviously, it would have given me confidence that I definitely didn't have. And she talks about, I thought it was making me cope, but of course it was just creating this mess and horribleness. Family of origin, the majority of women reported growing up in households where there was parental substance misuse. Now we know this already from some of the ACEs studies that we've done with women who have experienced domestic violence, where you're getting 60% grew up with alcohol and 40% with other drug use in the household home. They also grew up with compromised parenting, direct neglect and abuse, and often there was significant trauma experiences, either within the family of origin or within the community context. Family, though, on the flip side, was a really important source of support. It could be different family members, it could be extended family members, there might have been healing around some of the family relationships, but family was both the site of their troubles and potentially their source of support for some women. The important factor I'm going to pull out around this is domestic and sexual violence occurred for all 14 of the women, and 13 of the women described being in a domestic violence relationship from the onset. And I've spoken about this before. I am one of those people that, will I take the risk? Yes, I will take the risk. I was driving down the motorway, down the M7. I'd done 5 or 6 interviews, and already I was saying, there's always, in every single woman's experience, there was always a fella who she had her vulnerabilities, she had her risks, And there was always an initial relationship that she got into that started a further trajectory of harm. This was for one woman. I was 18, he was 18, I was 14. Anyway, I thought I had my life made. I was with this perfect boy. I could drink, I could have fun at the weekends. I could go to school if I wanted to or not. She describes that experience, and then she says, when I left him, I got into a relationship straight away and I had my kids, and this guy was abusive as well. Now, I didn't put up with him. I moved straight on to another one with another abusive person. I had 5 miscarriages, and obviously my 2 children have passed. I'm not saying he made me lose my kids, but it was all up in that vicious craziness. And in their descriptions, that vicious craziness started with this initial relationship, often as they were coming out of their teenage years or in their mid to late teenage years. Shame and stigma were a phenomenal theme in women's lives. And one woman described this as, I think the bit that I pull out of this quote is, I can't give you a reason that's good enough as to in relation to the consequences of me using drugs. They don't match up. And she described this so well in this quote. She knew the harm it was doing to her. She knew how she was being viewed as someone who was using substances, and she was saying, I can never give you a valid reason for the decisions I'm making, and the level of shame that I experience. And she says, shaming me doesn't get anywhere. And if you could only meet me where I'm at and encourage me to try and meet my goals. The intersectionalities, we could be here for an hour. There's so much rich information. But what can I flag to you really quickly? Because I know Ailbhe's going to tell me I've got 5 minutes left in about 10 seconds. So one of the important things that I really pulled out of this, having worked with women and worked with issues of domestic and sexual violence and substance use for quite a long time, is that women really focused on the outcome of the impact of their experiences on their children. So they didn't talk about the dynamics. They talked about that intergenerational pattern. They talked about, as a result of this, this is what's happened to my child or children, which I think is interesting because it gives us a point of intervention. The thing that I didn't expect and that wasn't in the interview schedule is, and it wasn't asked directly, so not every woman was asked this, but 45% of women of mothers described miscarriages or the death of a child. And the huge grief and devastation that this had caused them. And for me, it was just so hard hitting, because I thought, never in a service have I sat with a woman and said, has miscarriage or a death of a child ever been something that you have struggled with or dealt with or had to experience? So it's not something we talk about routine in services, in my experience. Of course, meeting the needs of children was such a positive motivator for change, and nearly all of the women talked about this. I'm just going to pull out a section from this quote because she talks about medication misuse, and we really need to think about how medication misuse fits with alcohol use. And she talked about when her daughter died and it shattered her. It was the breaking point for me. And then I found them, benzodiazepines. I can't describe it. I remember being in treatment and saying I was actually in love with the feeling it gave me, and that's why I was addicted to it. And if you ask me to this day, do I love them? Yes, I loved the way they made me feel. Would I go back? No. They helped me deal with it. Well, I thought they did. But then I got clean and I had to deal with it all over again. I'm going to just pull one other thing from the intersectionalities piece, and it goes with that bravery of what can we talk about and not name. And that is that I spoke about this yesterday, and a practitioner came up to me and I said, I'm so glad you talked about the transactional sex and the intersectionality of substance misuse and prostitution, sex working, or whatever terminology the women wanted to put on it. But one woman described, I needed money for drugs and I needed to be out of my head to do what I was doing, so I was left in this cycle and I couldn't do one without the other. They talked about the kind of mental health and this duality between mental health and substance use. What are the things that we're left with? women had 3 clear turning points in their trajectories where they needed help and support. One of these was when they engaged with the criminal justice system. So 3 of the women in the study were driving while intoxicated and stopped by the guards, and that was a turning point for them. And that is nothing I'd ever find in the literature before, and actually had found that experience really supportive. For the others then, issues in relation to children were such a pivot moment for them, and it could be a new baby, it could be a pregnancy, it could be advancing needs of the children, it could be a child with special needs, but children was the potential for where change happened. And then health concerns was the third positive one. So there was 2 things that I want to leave with you for what women said, and then I'm just going to pop up our slide around the policy implications. For the women, the difficulty of you can't get help for everything that you have going on here. And one of the women said, like, where is this somewhere else? You know, you need to go somewhere else. Where is this someone else? You know, can you tell me how to get to this somewhere else? Do I go down the road and do I turn left and then take a right? I was literally like, where is this place? Can you send me a pin to it on Google? And I thought it was such an important way to describe it. Another woman said, you know, recovering some substance misuse, addiction, whatever you want to call it, all of those intersectionalities, domestic violence, sexual abuse, rape, prostitution, you can't fix that in 6 months. We need to look at women's substance use and their alcohol use through the lens of potentially multiple experiences of abuse, trauma and exploitation, rather than the single trajectory of problematic use. We need to think about safety and her children's safety at every stage of our interactions. We need to think about medication. We need to think about pregabalin and benzos and how they feature in women's experiences and misuse, and sometimes health responses to her trauma. And we also need to think about how statutory and other services, particularly where there's criminal justice and child protection, can be a site of positive change. Thank you. Presentation on speed.
Get this one to work? Oh, is it? It is working. That's very good. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was so absolutely fascinating. In fact, I think that all of us would like to have been able to have had more of the information, because it is, as you say, incredibly complex, many-layered study with so much data and information that's relevant to people working across a number of different kinds of sectors and areas, but bringing it all together and using that multiple lens, or almost like a kaleidoscope, isn't it? And I know that there will be comments and questions there, because the policy implications are, I think, really clear, as well as very important. But we will move. We move on to our next speaker, and our next speaker this morning is Therese Doyle. Therese has been, you're very welcome, Therese. Thank you very much for coming here today. Therese has been a volunteer peer worker with the DAVINA project for actually just about the past 6 months or so. And she has been contributing to the development of the DAVINA manual and involved also in the delivery of training with social work students in Trinity and with the staff team in Sale, where the DAVINA project is located. She's just finished doing a peer training course with the Recovery College of Ireland. Therese, thank you very much. I know that you will be speaking personally, and I think I can say in advance that we all appreciate that, and I know how difficult it is. So a thank you before you even start. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Therese Doyle. I'm here today to tell you my story and how triple trauma in the home affected myself and my siblings. I'm 45, I have 2 sons, grown men, and 1 grandson. I am in recovery myself from narcotics. I don't like drinking because I saw the effect it had on my mum's family and my mum, and how it affected her behaviour. A typical week would be at the start of the week. She would be in a bad humour, but as the week went on, she got happier as she knew the pay packet was coming in. Once the pay packet came, she would drink until early the next week when the money ran out. Especially bank holiday weekends was the worst, as there were community family events that she would drink at from 12 o'clock in the day. I didn't enjoy these events, but I knew I had to go so that I could look after her and take her home. I sometimes had to go to the pub to collect her. I was about 10 years old, and I would see and hear things that a child shouldn't have to see. She was having an affair on my dad, and because I was going to the pub to collect her, I was pulled into the middle of it. And that's when I realised there was a problem at home. Mum worked really hard, and there were 7 of us kids at home. She worked 2 jobs, and Dad worked in a taxi. She was under a lot of pressure, and when I saw her in the pub, I could see she was having a good time, but it was tearing the family apart. I took a lot on myself, because if Dad was the one to try bring her home, there was always violence. It would always start with a verbal row about where she was all day, and then it would turn into physical between them, with plates thrown, furniture broken, windows smashed, and both Mum and Dad were hospitalised due to the violence on a few occasions. Mum was always trying to get help with her mental health. She tried very, very hard to stop drinking. The only way she could stop was by keeping out of the home. She eventually managed to get sober after 18 months in and out of hospital. When I was growing up, I was very quiet and very timid a person. I struggled bad in school because every time I was at school, I worried that she would get hurt, and I wouldn't be there to protect her. I basically never wanted to leave her side. As I got older, coming into my teens and going to secondary school, I would run away from the school, the girls, and over to the boys' school to see my brothers. I ran away from home once. I felt safe for my brothers because my older brother looked after me. He kept me safe and protected me. He taught me to cope by blocking out the sounds of fights, by listening to music on the Walkman. When I went into my teens, I suffered anorexia and ended up hospitalised myself. I think I wasn't eating because I constantly worried and afraid, wondering what would happen next. I hated myself, I felt disgusting, and bulimia was the only release I had. After hospital, I decided I needed to live with my grandmum. I didn't want to go back home as I didn't feel safe, and I realised what I had put myself through because of it. Even when my mum did stop drinking, it was really hard seeing her struggle with her mental health. I always just tried to block out what was going on and never really dealt with it. We also tried to keep quiet about what was going on in the house. We were told the kids were saying and never heard. Nobody listened to us, so I never knew how to ask for help or support. The only support I had was my grandmum, my Auntie Catherine. I lived with my grandmum for about 6 months while I was getting better from my eating disorder. When I was getting better, my mum was getting better in St. Patrick's Hospital. I saw my mum getting better. While she was there, this made me feel better, so I was able to get better too. We had a good few years together when we were both well. She got a job and we worked together. She suffered with her physical health after years drinking and died after contracting a hospital bug when I was 26. That's when things went downhill. It was a huge shock to my system and brought back the years of trauma growing up in the house with violence and addiction. I didn't know how to cope or get help, so I turned to drugs. I became hooked very quickly. Within 2 weeks of being on heroin, I was taking it every day. It numbed the pain. Within the first 6 months, I was broke. My home was broken. I was struggling as a young mum. I got help with the Ashland Clinic and was put on a methadone program. I was put on a maintenance, but I only wanted a detox. So I went out to work thinking I had it together. Each time I tried to give it up, I would come back using more, and I'd come back more addicted. In my late 20s, I got diagnosed as suffering with bipolar disorder. I fought the label of this diagnosis. And when doctors tried to help me, it was so hard for me to trust them. I wouldn't talk and I would avoid my appointments. I eventually suffered a breakdown and picked up some charges. I ended up in prison, lost my home, but thankfully my family stepped up to the plate for my children. I split up from my partner, realising it wasn't a positive relationship for me. It wasn't physical violence, but there was a lot of psychological and verbal abuse, and our relationship was tied up with drugs. Looking back now, when I got into the relationship with him, I was very vulnerable. I was shy and timid. Nobody taught me about the facts of life. I was 15 and I was pregnant by the time I was 17. Today, I am clear of heroin 9 years and clear of methadone 10 months. I have my own home. I am managing my mental health and keep up with my appointments with my drug counsellor and GP. I started coming to Sale in February this year and joined the DAVINA in April. DAVINA has helped me understand that other women are going through domestic violence too. So I know that I'm not alone. I've learned skills to keep me safe, and I now understand what I went through as a child. I feel stronger and more confident in myself, and I know I am worthy of a good life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Therese. You are a really remarkable woman, very strong and also very, very brave, and have had to be brave for a long time in your life, and I'm just admiring that and also very touched by it, and also just thinking of your great generosity now in giving back and sharing with others experiences that you should never, no child, no young adult should ever have had to go through. And thinking also something that we mentioned before we started, that you know the deep stigma around the issues that we're talking about today, the deep silence that surrounds them, means that Therese has to stand up and share that story with us. And that shouldn't have to happen either. We should have that understanding. We shouldn't have to bare our souls and our lives. So a very particular appreciation for you and the work that you're doing, which is really crucial to trying to move this whole society to an understanding of how we have to tackle issues of alcohol misuse and of other substance misuse as well, and not hide them under a carpet. Thank you. I would now very much like to introduce Rachel Fayne, who has been working with vulnerable communities of one kind and another for nearly 20 years. She has a real passion for social justice, and really her career has focused on looking and working on the front line of harm reduction services for people experiencing homelessness and substance abuse. A few years ago, in 2019, she joined the team in the SAIL project, which is a female-specific community addiction service. And she is currently the coordinator of the DAVINA project in SAIL, a project which supports women living with domestic abuse while also struggling with addiction. I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome Rachel here.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much to Therese. I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on what Therese was saying, because it's really tied up in what we're looking at here. So I'm going to focus a little bit on what are the kind of practice issues that come up when you're trying to work at the intersection of the two issues. Just to give you a bit of background, SAIL as Ailbhe was saying, is a female-only addiction service. We're based in the North Inner City. We've been going for about 28 years, and we've a strong focus on community education and empowering women through education. Around 2005, I think it was, we started the Solace to Sale programme, which was based on the Solace programme in London, and that was to support women who were coming to Sale who'd also experienced domestic abuse. So we developed a 6-week module-based programme that really looked at trying to open up those interventions to women who were coming to Sale. We did make it available to other services. It wasn't really picked up, and eventually we kind of stopped using it in Sale as well. I'm not really sure why that happened. I think it just kind of, the issues weren't coming up. And during COVID-19, we had to change our mode of working. We couldn't invite the women into us, so we said, right, we'll go out to their houses, we'll do an outreach programme. And when we knocked into their houses, we realised that women who we'd been working with for several years were living at quite serious domestic abuse, and they hadn't told us. So we were like, why actually haven't they told us what was going on for them? And we realised we were failing them. And that part of the reason was that we weren't actually asking the right questions. We weren't talking about domestic abuse on a daily basis, which you'd think we would, because we're like a women's service and it's such a prevalent issue, but it just wasn't happening. So we realised that we needed a more kind of specific response, and to make those conversations more normalised. So that's why we set up the DAVINA project, and realising that this was an area that we hadn't done, that the Solace to Sale programme somehow didn't meet the needs of the women. We said what we wanted to do was to keep the peers, so the women with the lived experience, at the centre of the development and delivery of the programme. So when the DAVINA project started, we said, look, what are the issues that we need to tackle? And they said we wanted to continue with the kind of Solace to Sale model, which would be a psychoeducational type programme that we could engage the women with. And we asked the peers, what are the main kind of topics? What are the things that you'd like to learn about? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that the women have spoken about in terms of why the intersectionality is an issue. So the first one, just to say ACEs, obviously Dr. Morton referenced this as well. And those adverse childhood experiences are very, very common in women who present to substance use services. It'd be quite common that they would have some adverse childhood experiences. One of the, if you look at what are the ACEs, one of them is parental substance use, and one of them is domestic abuse in the home. So it makes sense that with those ACEs, we also know that children who grow up in homes with domestic abuse are also more likely to experience domestic abuse in adulthood. So it makes sense that the two would go together, that you'd have that adult experience of domestic abuse and also an adult experience of substance use. So it doesn't make sense to try to separate those two issues and work with it in a siloed approach. A lot of the women described, because of those ACEs, that they would never learned how to cope, and as Theresa was saying, not learning how to cope with her emotions as she was a child, because she was parentified, having to look after parents and things like that, so not learning those coping skills. So a very natural way to cope is using of substances. Then the re-traumatization occurs, so you'd have that experience, and I think both Theresa and Dr. Morton referenced it, that you'd go into these early relationships at quite a young age, very, very vulnerable, and that relationship would then become abusive, and particularly if there's polysubstance use, so if there's alcohol and illicit drug use, then you're having to go to quite dangerous situations in which to secure drugs. So you're having to deal with like gangs and dealers, and a lot of dealers then being quite manipulative, and then that re-traumatizing you and bringing up your childhood experiences then. Homelessness was also a big issue, so and particularly with polysubstance use again, but any substance use comes with financial pressures where it's quite difficult to because you're spending your money on having to secure your drug supply or alcohol supply. So with homelessness then comes a much more difficult experience if there's domestic abuse as well. A lot of refugees don't want to work with women who are homeless because they're seeing that the homelessness is the issue rather than the domestic abuse. And that there's a lot of, in homeless services, there is a lot of violence. So women would sometimes align themselves to the heavier guy, the guy who was more violent. They'd align themselves to that guy because he'd protect them from everyone else, but then he'd be violent as well. So there was a lot of a big crossover there with homelessness. Criminality was another issue. So obviously for polysubstance use, drug use is criminalised. It's great to see that the Citizens Assembly has recommended decriminalisation. But a lot of women would be, there's certainly, if your substance use is illicit, then you're automatically criminalised. But then there's criminality in terms of, like I was talking about earlier, the financial pressures, so trying to secure supply. The other thing that the women talked about was enforced criminality. So if their partner was involved in gang crime or sale and supply, he would ask the woman to shoplift, to take charges, to cook, to hold drugs, those kind of things, that he would say that she would take a lesser sentence, and a lot of the time she'd be forced into criminality or trafficked into criminality. And then on family systems, a lot of the time, if there was a lot of ACEs, if there was family trauma, a lot of the time due to the child protection and welfare system, the family systems were becoming fractured, and that meant that she would then have less support in adulthood and also be less likely to seek support from the likes of TUSLA and also other services where she felt that TUSLA would get involved because she might have had childhood trauma for that. So particularly a lot of women that I'd have worked with would have grown up in care, and if that care experience wasn't a pleasant experience, they would then have even more fear about their own child going into care. Just to speak about mothering and some of the barriers that can happen with, in terms of women trying to mother their children, and how domestic abuse can interrupt their ability on mothering. A lot of women, if they're in an abusive relationship, would be discouraged from enrolling their children in after schools clubs, from going to creche from a young age, those kind of things, to further isolate the family. So it meant that there was less support services available for the children. The financial abuse would also have an impact on both the mother and the child, particularly if the substance use, all the money having to go on the substances. So if the abuser is taking control of the finances in the house, and then there's a school trip coming up, then there's a lot of financial pressure placed on the mother in order to be able to support that. In terms of bonding, obviously substance use can impact on bonding in terms of emotional availability, but the other issue that a lot of the women described was that the perpetrator would themselves try to interrupt the bonding as a means of control and abuse. So they would do things like say, oh, you're holding the baby wrong, give me the baby, baby's not to sit with you, you're coddling the baby, those kind of things. The parentification, Teresa spoke beautifully about as another issue there. And then the compounded stigma of society looks very harshly on women who drink to excess, women who use substances, and much more so if they're mothers, because not only are they a bad citizen, a bad woman, they're now a bad mother as well. So it's that extra stigma where it makes it so much harder then to go for help. So in terms of trying to work with the women, some of the barriers are sometimes their substance use will be controlled or encouraged by their abusive partner. So if you're a substance use service and you're supporting a woman to do like a safety plan, an alcohol plan, a reduction plan, she may not actually have the she might not actually have the agency over her substance use to comply with whatever plan you guys come up with. And this is a really good tactic by abusers, because it means that by encouraging her substance use, it means that she's more isolated from her family, from her community, and also much more difficult to get access to services. Particularly if there's polysubstance use, that leads to higher fears of the Gardaí and fears of social services as well. The judicial system as well can be a bit of a minefield for the women. So if you look at what are the main supports for domestic abuse, so where you go for help is you go to the Gardaí and you go to Dolphin House if you're in Dublin, or court services, or you go to Tusla. So they are the three services that if you are a woman who uses alcohol or uses drugs, you do not want to go to any of those services. And particularly if there's polysubstance use, as we said before, there's criminality, you could have a lot of confusion around the criminal justice system. So a lot of the women would describe that they couldn't go to the Gardaí in case they got taken in on warrants. They couldn't go to, they couldn't get a protection order in case their partner gets criminal charges. They don't understand the difference between the kind of family law system, the civil law system, and the criminal justice system. So there's a lot of confusion with that. In terms of women who are accessing day services and accessing homeless services, there can often be a bias where where domestic abuse is so common among women who use drugs and alcohol that it's almost looked upon as commonplace. It's like there isn't actually a need for an intervention because it's normal for those women to experience domestic abuse. And that even if there was an intervention, that intervention is pointless because she'll just go back to the abuser because she's so tied in with her substance use. Just to speak then about window of tolerance in terms of, this is particularly for women who suffered ACEs in their childhood, that they may have a smaller window of tolerance due to PTSD of any sort of stress. And then that window of tolerance can mean that they can't abide waiting, because that reminds them of waiting for their abuser to come home, those kind of things. They can't abide waiting, they can't abide stressful situations, so they're much more likely to relapse. And then if they relapse, sometimes services can withdraw support. So in the case of a woman who exits an abusive relationship, goes to refuge and then relapses, she may be asked then to leave the refuge, which heightens the risk of homicide. And particularly if the relationship is tied up with substance use, it's very easy for the abuser to lure her back and say, well, you're struggling with your withdrawals, I have some drugs here for you, I have some alcohols here for you, those kind of things. So just in terms of safety plan, when you are doing a safety plan with a woman, some of the things that will be impacted, access to refuges, like I said, is a particularly difficult one for women if there's polysubstance use, because refuges are concerned with their safety, and particularly if there's children in the refuge. So a lot of refuges, depending on who answers the phone, really, as whether or not there's a bed available, if they find out about substance use. But then, as I was saying, once you're in, if there's a relapse, you could lose your bed as well. In terms of safety planning as well, one of the things that we need to look at is if there's criminality, there's sometimes gangs involved. So you can get, as much as you can get a safety order or a protection order or a baron order against one perpetrator, if he's in a gang, he can actually get the gang to stalk you, so you can be gang stalked, and it's very, very difficult to deal with that because there isn't really a system in place. Like, you can't get a protection order or safety order against a gang because they're moving feet. And this is particularly true of women in homeless services, because some homeless services you'd have to be out for the whole day. So you'd have to leave your hostel during the day, and that means that if her perpetrator is also homeless, then the day services are all the open access day services are mixed gender, and there's only really a few of them, so it's very easy for that person to find out where she is. You can't hide when you're walking up and down O'Connell Street. In terms of accommodation, there's a few things there. So one, I spoke a little bit about homelessness. This can also be a problem for women who are then housed after a period of homelessness. So if they're housed with their perpetrator after a period of homelessness, the only way for her to get support would be to get him barred from the property, in which she'll feel that she's making him homeless and they're on the streets together, and so she has all this guilt. Or if she surrenders her accommodation, she's at the bottom of the housing list. so particularly if she has trauma from homelessness in the past. Also, if you're in overcramped accommodation, one of the very clear safety plan messages a lot of people do is, oh, can you avoid the kitchen? Can you go to a room with a window? Do you know, when you're in a studio, there isn't really, like, you can't necessarily avoid certain rooms, you know, those kind of things. It's much more difficult to plan for escape routes and things like that. Right. Having a phone or money, she's much less likely to have a phone or money. So if you're doing a safety plan, it's very difficult to say, oh, can you put away €20 a week into a runaway fund? Can you have a phone on you at all times? Not if he controls the phone. And then there's unique abuses as well that women who use substances can suffer, such as control of the medication or control of access to the substance, but also things like using the substance against you, so making sure that you feel like you can't remember what happened, or drugging you, or specifically spiking you, things like that, before or after an event, and then saying, oh, you don't remember, right? Kind of like that, you know, the Girl on the Train film. That's really, really easy to gaslight a woman who drinks or uses drugs. I'm out of time, so I won't go through that, but that's just some of the things. Some key approaches would be MI and motivation interviewing and harm reduction. The Safe and Together model, I think maybe Sarah might talk a little bit about that, or even mention Safe and Together. No. Well, just a small bit. So yeah, just to say, it's a model that encourages you to pivot to the perpetrator. So rather than looking at the mother and her failure to protect and her failure to mother, you're looking at the perpetrator of the domestic abuse. Focus on human rights and psychoeducation has been really, really powerful. It seems so basic, but a lot of the women that we've worked with don't understand, you know, about their rights. They don't understand consent. They don't understand boundaries. They don't understand managing mental health, coping skills. All of those things really empower women to exit relationships, but also to stay out of those kind of relationships as well. Support and access to justice, and support and safe coping as well. So access to justice is really important, because, as I was saying before, the criminal, they don't understand the differences between the three systems and have a lot of fear and trauma around the systems. And then safe coping is as an alternative to alcohol use or substance use, because if you're having a lot of stress in your life, it's very easy to, if you don't have good coping skills, to turn to those and to stay in that kind of cycle. So safe coping skills would be like the grounding exercises and things like that. And that's us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was so interesting, and I think very valuable, because it's very much your experience, your insights, really about that everyday nitty-gritty of living in these extremely vulnerable and complex, complicated situations. I'm very struck by how important it is also to name the difference that gender makes, and that gender is a real negative for women in particular, whereas gender is not necessarily, it is not a negative for men in this situation. So I think that's a very important recognition and realization that comes from that ground practice, which needs to be built in, of course, to our services, because it is not there at the present time. I think, generally speaking, that's a rather wide, and I mean our state-provided services rather than the kind of services on the ground, such as SAIL. So thank you very much for that. There's a lot there. I hope some of it we can maybe come back to in the question and answer session. Our next speaker is Senator Frances Black, and I'm really very pleased to welcome Frances here. Thank you very much for being with us today. I think as well as the areas in which we know Frances, her work obviously in the Seanad currently, which is so important, and also of course her background and her wonderful musical what would I call them, talents and gifts that you have as well, which make you such a very well-rounded person, but a person who has a very strong sense of social justice. And some time ago in 2009, Frances founded a charitable organisation which is called the RISE Foundation, which supports family members who have, whether it's a member with an alcohol, drug or gambling problem. And I know you're going to talk to us about the work of the RISE Foundation this morning. Lovely to have you here, Frances.
Thanks so much, Ailbhe, and I will keep an eye on the time. As I mentioned to Ailbhe, I could talk about RISE till the cows come home, really talk about the families that come to our services. But firstly, I want to say I'm in awe of all the work that's been done. I think SAIL project, I think Gary Broderick actually taught me when I was in college studying to be a therapist. So I'm in awe, and I want to say thank you, Teresa, for your wonderful story. It's very huge courage to be able to speak the way you did. So well done. So yeah, I'm going to talk about RISE today. I set up RISE in 2009. I'm going to try and run through these 2 slides. It's just to give you an introduction to RISE. I went back to college. Gary was one of my teachers in college, and I went to work. I trained in the Rutland Treatment Centre, and then they kept me on there as a locum worker, a locum counsellor. And while I loved working with those who were trying to get into recovery from addiction, I really felt, very comfortable and at home working with people who were trying to get into recovery. But it was there that I saw the families, and it was there that I met with the family members who would come in. They would have to come in of a Tuesday and come into group, and the anxiety and the stress and the worry that they carried with them, and when they came in to talk about what it was like for them. And then I remember watching a young woman walk out the gates of the Rutland Treatment Centre, 2 small children. Her husband was in for alcohol harm, and I just thought to myself, why does she not have a treatment centre that she can go to where she has a team of therapists? And that was really the inspiration for me to set up the RISE Foundation. So I really do believe that alcohol obviously can destroy not only the individual, it also destroys relationships, and it destroys family. And I think, Teresa, you gave a really good understanding of that. The whole family are absolutely devastated when there's one person in the home that has an alcohol problem. Now, RISE is a primary care organisation supporting family members in their feeling of powerlessness, their heartache, their stress and anxiety. Where philosophy is that it's important for the whole family to step into their own recovery. Alcohol harm of one person impacts the whole family, so the whole family needs recovery, even though they're not taking the substance or acting out in the behaviour. So we offer one-to-one counselling, 10-week psychoeducational family programme. It's developed to create awareness and educate families about the impact of alcohol harm. Not only alcohol harm, drug misuse, gambling, and more recently we've had family members who have somebody in their family, a partner, who would be very much engaging in sex addiction, and that can be soul destroying as well. But today I'm talking about alcohol harm. All our programmes are run by a highly trained team of counsellors who bring an unbelievable breadth of experience and compassion to their work, who really understand the impact on family, and not so much talk about the individual who has the problem, because everybody focuses on the individual who has the problem. We only talk about the impact on what's happening for the family member. RISE family members learn that they can't control a loved one's behaviour, they didn't cause it, and they can't cure it. And that's absolutely key, because often family members think they can fix the problem or they can control the person, and that can be very difficult, and they can't cure it. It can be very difficult for family members to understand that they can't fix this situation, and they can't fix their loved one. I'm going to play a video now. It's really the RISE video to explain the impact particularly of alcohol harm. We worked with a wonderful school, transition year students. They came to us about the impact of alcohol harm. The reason they wanted to do this video is because there were so many of their peers, their friends, their school friends who were living in very serious situations in their home. This is a school in Carlow, and they did this video. They came to us and said, we want you to show this video. So we've taken it now, and we show this video because this is out of the mouths of young people and the impact on them. So I'm going to show that to you now. How do I play this video now? Let me see. This one? Oh, here. Okay, so here goes. I hope you can hear it, okay.
When I was younger, we had a code word that my mother taught us. If we heard her say it when she answered the door, we knew to get to our rooms and stay there and not come out, so I guess we were mostly safe. There was another word too. I never heard my mum say it, but if we did, we had to leave the house and run to our neighbours. Sometimes in conversations or in class, I hear someone say the word, and some part of me inside starts to run. I can't describe that feeling. I never told anyone that story.
A small spark can ignite the light and hold.
The effect alcohol had on us. 3 girls and 1 boy. Less money, less family time, as he was either hungover or in the pub. No one wants to be seen with a drunk dad. When you're supposed to be worrying about normal teenage things, instead you're worrying if they'll drink and drive, or what kind of humour they'll be in when they get home. Or will there be a row? There were lots of rows.
You can't figure out what's real when you're losing grip in your fingertips.
I remember opening the door to go to school, and my father was lying there in the porch. He'd come home drunk again, and my mother didn't open the door when he was banging on it, so he'd fallen asleep outside. I stepped over him and started walking to school. I spent the whole walk trying not to cry, not because of him being there, but because I didn't wake him.
I used to wear a mask. It stopped them from asking questions. It stopped me from struggling to answer. When I was younger, I realised pretty early on that there were some things I just wasn't allowed to talk about. My parents' addiction being one of those. Something I've recently realised is that everyone has secrets that don't need to be secrets at all. No more masks. Let's talk openly about alcohol.
As you can see, the stress, anxiety and worry of having somebody you love with an alcohol, drug or gambling problem can be devastating for family members. The impact can be soul destroying. We here at the Rise Foundation are an organisation that supports families to step into their own recovery. We run a 10-week family programme and a one-to-one service that gives families that freedom to understand what's going on for them.
Don't let your addiction damage your children. Let's talk about the real effects of alcohol. Let's talk about the impact of alcohol on families. Alcohol affects families. Don't let it affect yours.
So, I mean, I thought that was really powerful. They came to us with their video, then we kind of incorporated it into the I suppose, the facts that they were all alcohol action, statistics that we took. So I'm going to talk a little bit now, and let me just say, we've been running our programme since 2009. We have a one-to-one counselling service. We have a 10-week family programme. We also have an aftercare programme. But we learn from the families. So all of this stuff that I'm going to show you now is because we've learned from. I mean, at the moment we're running 4 family programmes. 2 on Monday night, 1 on Tuesday and 1 on Wednesday, and we've waiting lists as well. So you can imagine the impact on family and how people are just they're hungry to understand the tools of how to cope because the stress and anxiety, and I'll speak a little bit about that now. It is very difficult to measure the stress and the anxiety and the trauma and the worry of having a loved one who has an unhealthy relationship with alcohol or with any substance or with any behaviour. It is very hard to measure, but we know from the work that we do, it can have a huge physical, emotional and spiritual consequence on the family, on family members. I can't tell you the impact it has
apart from the physical violence, but also even if there's a family member that's not physically violent in the home, it's about the impact on the individual. Often family members have irritable bowel, stomach problems, maybe stress-related heart issues, stress-related cancers even. The impact is just unbelievable. And then obviously emotional and socially as well, family members start to isolate themselves because of the shame. Family members who are affected by the impact of someone else's alcohol problem often feel depressed, frustrated, angry. Hypervigilance is a huge one, and completely exhausted because of it's almost like you're living in a type of a war zone, if that makes sense, because you never know when you're going to get the dreaded phone call. You're in that hypervigilant place. They're often exposed to trauma, that PTSD piece that somebody mentioned earlier. Physical and or emotional abuse often coincides. This can be detrimental to young children and young adults who grow up with a parent who has an alcohol problem. And we've already touched on that already. I haven't seen the evidence to show the impact yet of alcohol or any type of addiction in the home, but it's absolutely huge because we're dealing with it on a daily basis. Those growing up with a parent with an alcohol problem, there's adverse childhood experiences are absolutely frequent. The intergenerational trauma, and this is something I want to just touch on a little bit, of harmful drinking can leave a very deep negative imprint because the child will experience something that's called malignant shame. John Bradshaw has written a book called Healing the Shame That Binds Us, and that malignant shame or toxic shame really stops people from moving forward because, and I'll explain why now. The shame that begins in childhood as children, they often feel very vulnerable, really vulnerable, because they're living in that war zone, imperfect, low self-worth, really lost, scared, frightened. This is another one, impact of addiction in family on the child, sometimes learning difficulties. Am I to blame? That's a huge one. If I was a better child, maybe mommy or daddy or whoever the parent is won't drink as much or take the substance. Underperforming in school because they're obviously thinking about what's going on at home. Is something going to kick off today? Families strive, and is this my fault? And that's huge for children. Somewhere in it all, they blame themselves. Low self-esteem, huge, one of the main things that impacts children. They're easily damaged by inadequate parenting and other childhood experiences, from cruelty to benign neglect from family members and others in their development process. And can I just say a little bit about what we've discovered working with the families that we've dealt with? When somebody comes to us who let's just take a typical family, because it's not just, I'm only just talking about children today, because we family members who have partners, who have parents, who have adult children. We have a lot of family members who come to us who have adult children. But if we were to take just from the impact of a child, and often what happens if we have two people who have children, one of them is in the throes of alcohol harm or drug misuse or whatever it might be, the other parent will become so preoccupied with what's going on in the person who's in the addiction that they cannot be present, not only to themselves, but they can't be present to their children. And I can't tell you how, that's where often children get lost. So they end up the eldest might become the caretaker of the rest of the kids. It's just a minefield, and they start looking after each other. They might think we have to mind Mammy because Mammy is so preoccupied with what the other partner is doing. So it's amazing how it all manifests itself. So what we do is when that person comes to us, we make them aware of how they can empower themselves to not get pulled in to the negative impact of alcohol harm, and how they can empower themselves again so as that they can be present to themselves and then to their children. So I can't tell you how important that is, and we have seen unbelievable results. It's about prevention and intervention and breaking the legacy of that intergenerational trauma, and that's the work that we do. It's so important. It can be passed on to generations. Families with alcohol misuse, parenting is unreliable, inconsistent, unpredictable. Child is often left with feelings of shame, guilt, loneliness, emotional abandonment. The rules in a dysfunctional family are don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. And that's often what happens within the family dynamic. The secrecy become so strong. You know, children learn quite early, don't tell anybody, don't say anything to anybody. And now that's why I think this video is so powerful, because there was one of those little girls who was living in a really horrific situation, and her friends got around her and said, it's okay to talk about this. And that's what's really soul destroying. It's about learning. So really what we do at Rise is try and get people to talk a little bit more, to start learning to trust themselves, never mind other people, to trust themselves, because they're so preoccupied with not chaos and trauma and all of that. It's very hard to even think straight. And then obviously to start feeling those emotions in a very safe environment where they can allow themselves to speak. Depression, so this is the impact. I'm going to just go through these, I'm conscious of time. Depression, which is that unending crisis, feeling trapped, feeling numb, feeling defeated. Anxiety is huge when it comes to family members. The anxiety, there's a hypervigilance that happens for family members, that it's almost like they're coming in and they're shook. And sometimes they can't even be present to some of the psychoeducational stuff that we do, because they're in that traumatic place. So, and that's why the aftercare or the one-to-ones going along with it can work very, very well. It is an ongoing journey. They have a fear of abandonment, rejection, fear of safety, fear of others' reaction, plus a life that is really unpredictable. And that's all what I would call post-traumatic stress. That's what I would call hypervigilance. PTSD, overreaction to triggers and reminders, hypervigilance of the autonomic system, that thing around fight, fright or freeze, having flashbacks, recurring negative thoughts. These are all things that I genuinely believe you have to work with the family. And I have no doubt if you work with the family to get them to a place where they have an understanding firstly of addiction. And I don't mean to go into that place of being angry and resentful, which is important, because obviously that's a way of, minding yourself in it all, but also understanding the impact of it, and then really working with people to make them feel in that safe. RISE stands for Recovery in a Safe Environment, where they feel safe to be able to empower themselves, to not go down, to try and help themselves come back from that trauma and that hypervigilant place and those triggers, because often, children who are, and there's evidence around, I think it was Dr. Stephanie Brown spoke about children who often go into, who are reared in a home where there's alcohol harm, they will go into a relationship where there's addiction. So I'll just very, very quickly finish on recovery for family members. So this is the work that we do. I'll be 2 or 3 minutes on this. It's really important that family members, first of all, understand the impact on them, so as they know what they're working with, and understand the emotion that comes around it, so that they can identify the feelings. And then we try and talk to them about strong boundaries and self-care. I would change that around and say self-care first and then strong boundaries. That's very important. So we at RISE have found that family members respond very well to that psychoeducational approach to family recovery, especially if combined with longer term therapeutic support, including individual counselling and aftercare support groups. I won't go into this because that is the goal. It's detaching from not so much the person, but from the actual addiction, if you know what I mean. And I think that's really important. When they do that, or the addictive behaviour, when they do that, they can still love their loved one, but when they detach from that addictive behaviour, they really do start to take their power back and empower themselves, and they start feeling that sense of freedom, and let go of that control and all of those things that happens when it comes to family members, and then their behaviour starts to change, and then that's empower by example. So when the individual who's in the family recovery piece, they can empower their children by being the example. Not about preaching, just about being the example. And I think that's really it. Yeah. I mean, look, what do they recover? Health, integrity, dignity, relationships, money. When they start the recovery process, they show up, be aware, and get good information, listen actively to others, and ask for help. And I think that's it. Self-care is really important when it comes to the RISE Foundation. That's what we start working with first. We give them an understanding of what's going on, because you're in that chaotic place, you don't know what, you can't think straight, and then to talk to them about the impact of addiction. Only on the first lecture we talk about the impact on addiction on the individual, and the rest of the 9 lectures or workshops are all about the impact on first 5 weeks is about understanding it. The first 4 weeks is understanding. The next 5 weeks is about taking your power back and how to do that and the tools to deal with it. So that's it. Thanks very much, everyone, and well done to Ailbhe.
Thank you very much, Frances. That was, really the work of RISE is absolutely fantastic. That focus on the support for family, and even to have identified that all those years ago now, so many years ago, is really, I think, very important. And just that notion of intergenerational work, I was just thinking, you used the phrase of, the family as a kind of a war zone when there is that sort of situation, and how you can't actually fix that. You can't fix it in the present, and you have to understand it. And I think there's another layer there where we also have to understand that we can't fix it for the past either. And that is also something that I think we have to let go. I also want to say that video is wonderful. Those young women, those girls, talking about the importance of the drama then of taking off the mask, and that is so much about what, of course, Silent Voices is about. So thank you for today, and thank you for all your tremendous work. I will now introduce with pleasure our final speaker this morning, who is Sarah Rush. Sarah is the Child and Participation Project Worker in the Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse Project, which is hosted by Barnardos, working closely with TUSLA Domestic DSGBV services. And that Sarah has many, many years' experience of working with children and families as an educator, as a play therapist, and a social care practitioners. And I think that Sarah is going to actually share with us today some of the words and experiences of children and young people that she has been working with in this kind of area. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ailbhe, and thank you to Alcohol Action Ireland for this opportunity to share some of the words of the children and young people in the Empower Kids project. I'm going to just briefly introduce you to the project today. The project is called the Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse Project, and I also want to show you some of the resources that the children and young people have been involved producing. So recognise someone there. Hopefully the green isn't too glary. So we're really about keeping children's voices central. So children and young people who have lived experience of domestic violence and abuse, we want to know what it is that they want to say about their lived experience, and that's what this project is. So the project, the Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse Project, as Ailbhe said, it's a partnership between Barnardos and TUSLA Child and Family Agency. It was established in 2019, which is kind of 4 years ago at this stage. The overall purpose of the project is to assist in increasing the visibility of children who live with domestic violence and abuse, to hear what it is that they want to say, to listen to their lived experience, and to work together to identify what it is that they need, and I suppose adapt our service responses as a result of that. One strand of the project is children's participation, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that here this morning. Why is it important that we support the voice of the child? For children and young people to feel included, to have their lived experiences validated and listened to and heard, their expertise recognised. They are the experts, they are the ones who've lived with this, to facilitate them to give voice to their experiences, to empower them, and for all of us, I suppose, to increase and develop our understanding of what it's like for children and young people who have lived with domestic violence and abuse, what it's like for them, what it is that they want to tell us about that. They are, I suppose, are the experts, so they are quite well placed to be able to tell service providers what it is that they need. What is the response that they need? So just briefly, the project uses the Laura Lundy's model of child participation, the 4 elements of including the voice of children and young people, space, voice, audience and influence. And we also use a child's rights perspective, keeping Article 19 and Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child kind of front and centre in the work that we do. Keeping the idea that children have a right to live free from violence and abuse, and that children also have the right to express their views in matters that impact them and affect them, and that these views need to be given due weight and need to be heard and listened to. So, to bring you into the project is called the Empower Kids Project, and it's a multi-agency collaboration. So we partner with about 13 services from all around Ireland. Many of them are domestic violence specialist services. You can see some of the names there: Saoirse, Adapt, Women's Aid, Cúnsair, Daughters of Charity. So when I say partner, what I kind of mean is that all of the children and young people who have shared their experiences with us do so through their key workers in the service that they're already attending. So it's very, very safe. They're already receiving a lot of emotional support, which is incredibly important. So the starting point for this project, the starting point to hear what it is that children and young people have been through in their experience. The starting point was this definition, which was made into a little video, all words of children and young people, and I'll just play it here now.
It is shouting, name-calling, crying, and sometimes even punches, bruises and blood.
It gets louder and louder. They don't think we can hear, but we can, even if we're in the last corner of the house.
We're worried that Mum might get killed.
We hope it will pass and things will be back to normal, but we are still scared thinking about when it will happen again.
It's a really bad feeling in our heart. It feels like it's broken. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies too, and our bones start to hurt.
We find it really hard to stay out of it. We try to stop it, but it doesn't work.
It's our job to protect our little brothers and sisters.
Sometimes we are told whose side we're on. We don't like it.
Some adults think children are stupid, but all children have a voice.
Together, we can paint a better picture.
Just speaks for itself, really. Lots of themes that children and young people have referred to in that have been shared by other speakers here today. So how many children and young people have participated in the Empower Kids project? So actually, when we had a look at it, over 4 years, 74 children and young people between the ages of 6 and 19. So it's quite a span, all through their key workers. So all of these children and young people, they have really good emotional support behind them as well, because this stuff is tough. So once the definition was there, the next natural piece seemed to be understanding, listening more, asking children and young people more, tell us more about your lived day-to-day experience. And that was the next project. This is a longer video. I'm going to play it because it just speaks to itself. It's available on YouTube. It's called Hear Me, See Me, Keep Me Safe.
When I'm with Mammy and Aoife,
I want to draw a rainbow all around us to keep us happy. But Daddy gets angry. I get scared. I wish he would stop because I don't want anyone to get hurt. Aoife tries to protect me, but I wish I was far away from all the fighting and the noise.
But sometimes it's like a deathly silence, and the atmosphere takes over the home and seeps into every pore. I want to protect Sean in a way that I never had been, to take him upstairs, away from it all, and make him safe. But when he gets angry, you just freeze. You accept that it's going to happen, and you have no control. You feel invisible, and that feeling follows us all day. When we go to school, it has a really big effect on us.
I try to blend in, but I still think about all the fighting and hating. I wish I was able to tell my friends or the teacher, but I can't because I'm scared, and they don't know what's happening in my family. Is this normal?
I worry all the time. I worry about what might happen to Mum. Is she okay now? I worry that me or Sean might get hurt. And I worry about Mum getting upset if Dad does do something to us. It's too much responsibility, and it can be totally overwhelming. I'd like to be noticed more. Sometimes I might look okay, but really I'm hurting. And I show my teacher my mask, so I can disappear behind it.
The Gardaí come to our house sometimes. When that happens, I feel like they need to get him in trouble for being bad. I want the fighting and hating to stop.
I wish I could have done something to stop it. I wish he accepted that he needs help. I wish he could see that he is at fault. I wish he could put himself in our shoes. I try to keep Sean safe in our room, and we talk about the things we wish for. We wish that people would be kind to us, because we feel the pain too. We carry the feelings in our hearts.
We want people to listen to us and believe what we say.
We want people to tell us it's not our fault, and we want to be asked about what happens next, because that affects us a lot. Most of all, we want you to see us, hear us, and keep us safe.
We want to be asked about what happens next. So following that participation project, children, through the participation work with us, started kind of naturally, telling us what it was that services needed to be doing better. So children's expert advice, they are the experts. And this was the next resource that was launched and produced. Some of you may know it. It's called Our Rights, Your Responsibilities. It's 20 key messages, all from the children and young people. So things like listen to us, we might be young, but our voices and opinions matter. Take time, slow down, no raised voices, keep us safe. So this is a poster. It's available in a few different formats, and I suppose our hope is that more and more services will have it up in their project, in their centre, so children can see it. The next piece that naturally emerged from the work with children and young people was that children wanted to support other children and young people. And this was the result of that. So this resource was launched last year. It's called Me to You, What You Should Know. It's what children want to say to other children in the same situation. Trace, when you were saying something about putting headphones in the Walkman and your brother, I was thinking of this because there is something on this here. So get some earbuds or headphones so you don't have to listen. So this resource is available again in a poster. It's also available in 2 leaflet formats. kind of a black and white leaflet where a key worker can print it out and use it with a child or a young person to talk through the different strategies and to colour it in. And it's also available in a colour version. A really important piece of the children and young people's participation work is what's happening to their voices. What are we doing with them? It's all very well, I suppose, producing nice resources, but who's going to hear it and who's actually going to do something as a result of what the children and young people have said? So these are some of the different policies and achievements to date with regard to audience and influence. The children and young people in the Empower Kids project fed into the third strategy and the national policy framework. There was a video produced for the NCCA, a video for schools, because schools is so key and has been highlighted as so key by children and young people. The resources that I've shown you there are used in training all around Ireland and outside of Ireland as well. And there is a practice framework being developed as well, which will be available, I suppose, next year. So a little bit about the intersectionality in service responses. These are just some of, in the green boxes there, some of the things that children and young people have told us about the intersection of domestic violence and abuse in a family and alcohol misuse. So I think it's really, really important for a service to consider and identify what other adverse experiences are present along with domestic violence and abuse, to ask the question and consider. Really important for services to work together, share information, develop a shared understanding at a local level. And as we were chatting before, we were talking about a really important point, I think, is to really consider how a perpetrator of domestic violence and abuse in a family may actually get in the way of or interfere with or cause kind of get in the way of the recovery or treatment of the other parent. And people are nodding when I'm saying that. So they might kind of interrupt someone who is getting treatment. And I suppose just because a parent is attending counselling once a week for alcohol misuse, that's not going to stop patterns of domestic violence and abuse if they're still present. So just because one is being addressed doesn't mean that the other is. I'm at the end of my time. Just wanted to let you know that all of the resources are available for anybody to use. They're available on the Barnardos website. Our services work with families under a section called Childhood Domestic Violence and Abuse, and they can be printed out and the videos can be accessed there as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for talking to us about the Empower Kids project. It's really, really interesting. I have to say that just when, I think of that little voice actually saying, I worry all the time. It's just, for me, it goes right in there somewhere, and I think probably for everybody. But the work that you're doing, and to think that, 74 children have actually been able to participate in Empower Kids over a relatively short space of time, and the experience that you've gained from that and that you're sharing with us is really important, and it shows the importance of doing that work directly with children who are exposed to these really horrors, I think is the only thing I can say. So thank you very much, and indeed thank you to all our speakers, but I want to call on you again to pop up here, just so, because we do have some time for a short panel discussion. Sheila, I think, are you not going to? You're going to sit, okay. So look, just come up and sit down here beside me, and we will, what I'm going to do maybe is invite any comments or questions from the floor. Does that sound all right to people? Because we have a relatively, don't leave me now, don't I? Thank you. Because we have a relatively short space of time. So May I just see if anybody does have a comment or question that they want to ask? Oh gosh, we're really talking big there. Would you just put your hand up so I can get a sense if people do want to actually comment or ask a question of any one of our speakers? Yes, okay. So, and you might be others may be thinking of theirs. So would you like to go straight away there and just, and you might say your name and an organisation if that's relevant.
So my name is Karen, I work with the HSC. I've been employed by the HSC. I've been employed by the HSC just to start up a new programme around health conversion. So if you're caught by the guards to be in possession of drugs for personal use, you'll be diverted into the HSC. And it's awaiting legislation, it's not up and running yet. But I feel like women won't really benefit from that programme because women don't routinely get stopped and searched. I wanted to ask Therese and anybody who's working with women as well, just around where do you think would be a good place for that early intervention for women who are using substances, maybe to cope with situations in their lives but they have not yet reached dependence? Where do you think is a good point to intervene?
Right, okay. Is that Rachel Joyce, who you really...
Yeah,
yeah, just speak up. I think there's a lot of feedback on the mics there, so
so we have in Sale we have a justice involved program called Rio, and women actually do get stopped and searched. So it would be a good intervention point for them as well. One thing that I would like to address is that I spoke a little bit about that forced kind of criminality. A lot of women are forced by their abusive partners to hold drugs because like that there's that they're less likely to get stopped and searched, but that if they do, the perception is that they'll get a lighter sentence. Actually, women are more likely to get shorter custodial sentences, so they're more likely to be on remand than in the male prison. So I think that is a point, but I also wanted to point out that under international trafficking legislation, if you coerce somebody into committing a crime, that is actually trafficking by definition. But we don't have in the legislation anything, we don't have being trafficked as a defence in the legislation for some reason. So women who are trafficked into criminality can't actually use that as part of their defences. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I just want to point that out. Yeah, it's another thing we should read.
Does anybody else on the panel want to come in on that one? Sarah, yes.
Hi Karen, good to see you in your new role. So I think that's a really interesting question. So the women in the study said two things that are difficult for us to hear. One is, why didn't you intervene when I was a child? Okay. There were services involved, you knew what was going on. It was an intergenerational pattern that was very severe at that point, and don't forget, the women were from 25 to 60, but that was just a very common piece, that they had been engaged with services, and you might have had that same experience. And then the other thing was that they were involved in health services and interventions from a very early stage. So I think for the women in the study, it was nobody wanted to hear what else was going on for me. You might have more to add to that.
Yeah, I would agree. From watching, especially...
You might need to speak up a little bit there, Therese, I think.
Especially from watching this piece here from Barnardos. If I was brave like the kids now today to want to talk about it, or if I had more support, can I say, would I went down the road of drugs? I don't know. If I had that support, definitely, it probably would have been better.
One of the important points that I really learned from the peers, I think when we started the DAVINA project, we thought that it was about access. That these women needed access to services like everybody else. What we learned was that their experience was unique and different, but also that the lack of intervention that they experienced, they'd actually internalised that as them not deserving of help, and internalised it as kind of a normalisation of the thing. So the fact that they had staff members in their lives that didn't that didn't say, God, this is problematic, this is scary, are you okay? They internalised that as going, maybe it is okay.
Yes, exactly. Sheila.
Just one particular suggestion actually, it's a programme that we've been advocating for within Alcohol Action Ireland, Silent Voices. It's a thing called Operation Encompass. It's actually working in the UK and it's actually working in Northern Ireland as well. And the basic idea behind it is that if the police attend the family home overnight, that by the next morning, and there's children in the household, by the next morning the school where the child would attend would be informed. And the idea is that the child coming into school is given or is met with a bit of support, a bit of understanding. The Operation Encompass programme, provides training, for the school, and the support is very much on what it is that the child wants. But at the very least, they're hopefully not going to be met with, why haven't you your homework done? And maybe a bit of stuff like that. But it's that kind of one kind adult, one good person who could be there and can be understanding. And I think just in that space where you have justice maybe involved, and you can make the intervention when one service knows, we need to let somebody else know as well at the same time. So that's just, I don't know what to say. That's under consideration. It's in the new strategy for domestic violence. If you have any influence with our Minister for Justice, keep knocking on our door, keep saying this is a very, very successful programme. And one of the things that's actually very interesting about it is that where it's an operation in the UK, parents, there have been, literally no parent has actually ever complained about it because they want their child to get the support. It's not a case of saying, don't be saying, there is a recognition that the child does need that support.
Well, your plea there, I've certainly noted that, and I don't know if I've any influence. I've no influence with the Minister for Justice, but I know people who'll be, I hope, on the new agency's board, and I think that we should speak with them. It just occurs to me that something like Encompass also means that there is the raising of teacher awareness of the immediacy and urgency of dealing with of simply being aware of the problems and so on and so forth. I mean, are there other, and I know there's another question there, but just arising from this, do the panel have a sense of other actions which need to be put in place and which could be put in place, if you like, at governmental by state agencies to begin to break down the silos and to provide that kind of support which is so urgently needed? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll kick it off if you want.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll start it and then I'll roll.
Yeah.
I think the big challenge is that combination of action and ideology. And you named this at the very start, Ailbhe, and I think it's been touched on by so many of the speakers, and it's there as a thread in certainly the women that I spoke to. The use of alcohol is so normalised that we don't think of those points of intervention. We know there's children in our classrooms, we know there's children in our community networks that are, in our GA clubs, in all of these contexts that are having those experiences at home, but it's very hard if there's no clear, I suppose, action that's underpinned by ideology that says this is not okay. So I think action and ideology have to be very much go hand in hand, and we have such a normalisation of alcohol within the Irish context. I think that is a significant barrier.
Yes.
I think I would agree with that. I think we have a very unhealthy relationship in Ireland with alcohol, and it's kind of almost put up on a pedestal, and I think, Sheila will agree with me when I say that, you often see, big kind of Obama presidents coming over and holding up the pint of Guinness and everybody cheering. And it's like, it was like in the video, behind, the statistics, but behind every statistic there's a family, there's a child, there's and I think but I do think it's getting better, in fairness. I do think, and I think the work that Alcohol Action have been doing has been very powerful around bringing up that awareness around the impact of alcohol, certainly over the last few years. I just think that we really need to focus on intervention and prevention and breaking the legacy that's carried on down through the generations. And it's that intergenerational trauma is huge, and even if you know, for example, we had one woman who came to us, an adult, you know, and her constantly getting into relationships with men who were alcoholic, right? Or I shouldn't use that word, sorry, Sheila, but people, you know, who had an alcohol issue, and she wasn't angry. Her father was somebody who had an alcohol problem, but she wasn't angry with him. She was angry with her mother, because her mother was so preoccupied with her father's alcohol harm that her mother was very angry. So, like, I genuinely believe if we can get to the children, if we can get to the families, and just and maybe get to the schools and talk to the teachers, and, you know, just educate, get in there before it gets to that point where it's absolutely, you know, where there's violence, you know what I mean? Get in, the intervention piece is so important before it gets to the really, really bad place. I think, I don't know how you would feel about that, Trace, or
the intervention before it does get...
Yeah. One of the things that's quite challenging is because the two issues are so siloed at a policy level. So, like the third strategy, which is wonderful and it's really, really brilliant, it doesn't actually mention alcohol use or substance use. So it means that substance use services cannot access funding under the new funding stream that's coming to try to tackle these issues. And I know for myself, my background's obviously substance use services. We have like an entire like assessment form that's backed by public health, and they said you need to do this assessment form, and that goes into the Health Research Board. And there actually isn't a question on the assessment form about domestic abuse. The question comes at one point, which is in the risk assessment, and it's within the same question it asks if they are a victim or perpetrator. So what kind of an assessment are you doing with someone where you're like, have you either perpetrated or are you a victim? In the same question, they're not going to be able to share with you what their experience is. And I think the other problem with those kind of brief assessments is because it's so complex, and I think you'd almost need to do what Sarah did, where you're spending 40 minutes talking to a woman, because it's so layered that actually sitting down and going yes or no questions, have you experienced this, that or the other, a lot of women aren't able to answer those questions because it's too complex.
So I think communicating the importance of understanding the intersectionality. The problems do not come in ones, they come in multiples and have to be dealt with in that flexible, because what you're saying about substance abuse services not being able to apply for funding equally, my understanding is from a distance, it's true, is domestic violence services can't really reach over into
health,
exactly. So it's really foolish, because it's counterproductive, and good money is being spent on services on either side and never do the two meet. Can I just say we did have a hand that was up there at the back, which, yes, if you'd like to.
Good morning. Just directing a question to Sarah from Barnardos. I wondered, out of the 75 children over the 6-year period of the programme that was mentioned, were there any children immediately in homelessness identified in that period of time to have entered homelessness, and is there a likelihood of any of them entering homelessness in the coming year or so?
I don't have kind of clear stats, I suppose, to answer that, but many of the children and young people who would have participated over those 4 or 5 years would most definitely have had experience of having to flee the family home and go and live in a refuge for a period of time. And even though I suppose we don't have stats to sort of clearly say, but we do know that some families, having been in a refuge, can end up in the homeless system. So maybe that might answer that. So many of those, the service, out of those 13 services that we kind of partner with, those services are kind of from the range of domestic violence services, you know, starting from crisis through to recovery. Many of them are women's refuges. So many of those children and young people would have at some point had to flee the family homes.
Okay, thank you. Let's have another
Hi,
hand here.
My name is Alice Coughlin. I'm a community mental health nurse working with the HSE. So my question is, I've done a little bit of reading around alcohol. I'm by no means an expert, but what it did seem to come up was when people presented to the ED with physical health issues, often there was a background of alcohol misuse that wasn't picked up in the assessments. And from what I can understand is the best chance of those people accessing the service they need is through opportunistic intervention at that stage where they present to the ED, and then rather than signposting, it would be more of a handhold and exercise. Now, from what was said here, it seems to be one of the points where women are likely to look at their substance misuse is when they have children. And I'm just wondering, would perhaps be when women enter a maternity hospital to have a baby, would that be a point where they could receive some education around maybe their own addiction or the impact of that on children? And would that be a good opportunity maybe to start the psychoeducation part? Or even when they go in for their prenatal classes to have that built in, because people are very aware of, postnatal depression in those areas. The nurses monitor daily when a woman's in the hospital for postnatal depression to identify those risk factors. Would that perhaps be an area that could be looked at and utilised as a point of opportunistic contact?
Yes, good question.
Sarah?
I
know Women's Aid have a fantastic
Yes.
maternity outreach service that does just that, where there's dedicated project workers who partner with all of the main hospitals.
Okay.
Well, it's still developing. In
It's
other
still
words, it has 3-year funding, that programme, which
Yeah.
is working with a number of the maternity hospitals. It focuses specifically on domestic violence, but it is exactly the same principle that you're raising there, which is that is a
Intervening,
very key. Who was it who spoke about the turning points? It's a very key turning point moment for a woman. So,
sorry.
I just wanted to say, and again, it's domestic violence and abuse, but very, very intersectional as well. Probably early next year, we have been working on another animation to highlight the impact on children 0 to 5 years of domestic violence and abuse, which we're hoping will be used to help everybody understand the impact of this stuff on the very young and pregnancy as well.
Very good. Sheila? Oh, sorry, Sarah,
We
beg your
do
pardon.
have, I think, a number of midwives that specialise around in substance misuse. I think so it is a key point of intervention. I think what gets potentially the challenges are the two things around the intersectionality. So, we know from other research is women will present with the issue that is putting their life most at risk. So she may talk about the domestic violence because she perceives that that's the biggest risk in her life and not the substance misuse. And we know from the evidence from the IRC study that women often see their alcohol or drug use as the only thing they have that helps them cope. And there's further study done in the US that show that actually when women stabilise their use, the full extent of the risk that they're being exposed to in terms of the domestic violence really comes to the fore for them, which is extremely frightening if there's also then children and pregnancy, and then it's the fear and the stigma, because if they disclose at that point what are the child protection and welfare implications. So it's absolutely, you're right, it's a point of intervention, but it still has all those complexities around it.
Of course, we come back
we're
always.
normalised in prenatal education. It was one of the things people spoke about in it and gave people the information because they've 9 months to think about it. That kind of way, like if it was just in those classes about your breathing and your bits and bobs, whatever it was, if there was some way of doing that, I think. But I don't know.
Well, it does, it is definitely there, the thinking about that and the recognition is there, and that will, I'm quite sure, develop and expand and be strengthened. And particularly, talking about the ways in which you're speaking with Women's Aid, for example, and looking maybe at how that can be developed there in the maternity hospitals projects. There was one more question, which we take maybe very quickly, because we are just slightly over our time, I think, but go ahead there.
I'm just wondering why there's this block to doing anything to protect children. Like there's wonderful things I'm looking at there, all those leaflets. I don't see those leaflets in schools where children can actually see it. I think that video of those teenage girls, I think Trace might understand. I lived a life very like yours. Both my parents were alcoholics. One died from alcohol intoxication. She ended up with no eye because my father kicked it out of her. I went to school daily. Everyone in my community knew what was going on. The police were in my house every single weekend. Nothing's been done about it. The only reason I have an interest in all this is to protect the children that are going to school like I was.
Yeah.
And I see all these wonderful resources, but all I wonder about is the children going to school. Like that girl there stepping over her father in the bush. I've done all that. But there's no one protecting the children. And I just keep hearing there's a government block. Why? We know the statistics of alcoholism in Ireland. You've got to protect the children at a young level. You've got to get, and it's never about taking kids out of the home. Because I really understand what you said. I was protecting my mother constantly. I hid her bottles. I'd be killed for that. He found her with the bottles. She'd be killed more. No one wants to be taken away from their parent. I know I certainly didn't. But how do we give them the support? All this information is coming from the children who are obviously in support. I'd love to know how they got there. But we need to look more as people who have obviously gone through it and see the effects of it. How to reach these children and who in government is blocking it. That's what I'd love to know. Why is it taking so long? That is a wonderful thing they do in the UK. That a guard. It's not about getting in and taking kids out or, it's not about that. It's about, I called to a house last night and the mother was at the bottom of the stairs and there was blood all over. I clean it up and I go to school as normal. I was very high achieving in school because I so didn't want anyone to know what was going on. I was the clown, I got A's and everything. No one ever said to me or my 4 siblings, my brother drowned with a friend, he jumped into the lake. You've had all alcohol. And to this day, I do not see one child is being protected.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. And, I think myself that what Silent Voices is contributing to and trying to work on it is precisely to deal with that. Why is nothing happening, or why does nothing seem to be happening? And it's to really answer that question. I don't think that there is some conspiracy there blocking it. I think, as Frances and Sarah and others have said, that we live in a country which takes alcohol for granted, which sees it as part of normal life, and which thinks fundamentally it's really okay, or even sometimes quite funny, if people get drunk. And changing that is about changing a whole culture. And I think everybody who has spoken today, and obviously the work of Alcohol Action, is about contributing to that process of saying it is absolutely not okay. And let's actually look at, if you like, the first receivers of the damage and the harm that alcohol does are children, and let us at least look at the children and protect them. So you actually put your finger on the very nub of it all, and that comes from your own very painful experience. I want to say thank you for saying that. I'm not going to go back to the panel because I think it is really what we've been speaking about, but I will, since we're at the end of our time now, just ask Sheila if there's anything that you want to add, Sheila.
Firstly, I want to thank everybody, all contributors, and what's been said, and particularly know that in any gathering like this, there are always people like yourself who have the lived experience of it. I want to just direct you on our website. We have a website of resources, because I'm very conscious just, maybe stuff that will come up there. So there's a toolkit of resources that might be of help. In relation to how can we actually reach people, I think schools are absolutely imperative here. I would like all schools, all teachers to be trained in this area. This is something, again, we've been advocating for. As a very first step, there's the Hidden Harm Strategy, which is a linkage between TUSLA and HSE, which does provide training. It really needs impetus, and I know that there is a wish and desire for that, and it needs funding. Not only do TUSLA staff and HSE staff need to be trained in this, it's teachers and anybody who has any access to children, like say youth projects, sports. because that kind of thing of the one adult who maybe can be that support, who can really do something. So that training is there. It just needs a little bit of funding really to roll it out, to have it further than that.
And so we all need to go out from this morning and from yesterday and from tomorrow and so on, and actually talk about this, break the silence and say this is what is happening. And I would certainly, think that each and every one of our panellists this morning, our speakers, has really given us an enormous amount of information, but also great insights and a great analysis of what the problem is and how we can actually set about solving it. So I want to thank Sarah and Frances and Rachel and Therese and Sarah, and also to say thank you to Alcohol Action for all of the work that you're doing. So thank you all, keep up your really excellent work, and thank you to all of you for attending today.
And a big thank you to Ailbhe herself.
So interesting, such a fascinating morning. I learned so much.